Here's a riddle for you guys. Probably the longest riddle you've ever heard, but then again, I don't call myself long writer for nothing. There's a game that Blizzard made in the early 2000s. It had a variety of playable classes, and each class has 3 trees that they can spend points in, and each time you level up, you gain a point. And each tree has its own theme to it. The playable classes range from casterish to melee-ish. The class furthest on the casterish end of the spectrum has a tree full of fire abilities, a tree full of ice abilities, and another tree full of energy-ish abilities. Next to this is another class, also pretty much a caster, but who has a kind of a not necessarily evil but certainly looks evil-ish bent to them. This second caster has a tree that specializes in summoning minions, a tree that specializes in debuffs, and a tree that specializes in direct damage spells, albeit with more damage over time stuff than the Fire and Ice caster has. On the far melee end of the spectrum, we have a class that can wield a huge variety of weapons, has a whirlwind attack and other melee strikes to put them to good use, and also has a whole bunch of shout abilities. Right next to him is a Paladin class with a variety of auras, a whole bunch of abilities that look like augments to his melee attack, several abilities that target only the undead, and at the deepest part of one of the Paladin's trees, we have the Paladin's only direct range damage spell that can hit anything, not just the undead. Now, with all this context, here's the riddle. Was I just talking about Diablo 2 or World of Warcraft when it first came out in 2004? The answer to this riddle is just plainly yes. Every single thing that I just said applies both to Diablo 2 and to World of Warcraft. The more you look into it, the more you'll see that World of Warcraft borrowed a lot from Diablo 2. I mean, check out the inventory system in Diablo 2. Listen to the sound effects. This game is totally WoW. Or rather, since WoW came out in 2004 and Diablo 2 came out in 2000, it's much more accurate to say that WoW is totally this game. I actually bought Diablo 2 about a year ago precisely because I wanted to do a video displaying how so many concepts from Diablo 2 made it into WoW. Especially I wanted to show how Diablo 2 Paladins influenced World of Warcraft Paladin abilities. But now that I've played Diablo 2, and now that I've seen and reviewed the last 10 years of World of Warcraft's transformation, I realize there are even more lessons to be gained from looking back at Diablo 2 than what the heck Blizzard was thinking when they made vanilla Paladins. The fact is, Blizzard's overall game design philosophy has changed so much over the years that it's almost unrecognizable. Back in the early 2000s, their design philosophy for games like Diablo 2 and WoW was make a bunch of spells that make sense from a game design perspective, throw them at the players, and let the players have fun figuring out what works for them. Figuring it all out is part of the fun. Nowadays, they're more like, okay, what role does this ability have? If it doesn't have a good role, then we trim the ability out. The old let them figure it out for themselves paradigm meant that exploration of different builds was possible, and I'll admit there was some fun in that. But the newer philosophy makes good and sure that we have the tools we need to get the job done, and the old philosophy didn't always make sure we had that. The Paladin class took the brunt of that big time. That being said, Diablo 2 Paladins weren't that hard off compared to vanilla Paladins, but it's hard to know where to begin explaining it. I guess I'll start listing some of the problems vanilla Paladins had that Diablo 2 Paladins didn't have. First of all, vanilla Paladins didn't have any on-demand strike abilities. Most of their abilities were augments to their regular attacks instead. Secondly, vanilla Paladins had only one spell that could hit anything at range, and it had an agonizingly high mana cost and cooldown, and ridiculously low damage. Also, the only thing vanilla Paladins could do in a group, the only role they could play, was as a buffer and a healer. They did not tank or DPS well. Probably the most painful of these was the fact that they had no on-demand strikes. And believe it or not, you can see why from looking at the Diablo 2 Paladin. When you play as a Diablo 2 Paladin, there are pretty much 3 skill trees you can put points into when you level up. Offensive auras, defensive auras, and combat skills. This kinda sorta corresponds to the vanilla Paladin's Retribution, Protection, and Holy trees respectively, but there really are a lot of differences. For instance, Holy was kinda sorta mostly about healing, while combat skills had quite a few strikes and other non-aura abilities. It was kinda like Blizzard said, okay, anything that isn't an aura goes into this tree. Now, while we go through these skills, a lot of them are going to look familiar if you played in vanilla. In fact, some of them were lifted verbatim from Diablo 2 into WoW with few, if any, changes. Some abilities are practically identical in all but name, and for some things that went from Diablo 2 to WoW, the name is the only thing that made the trip. For instance, 3 of the offensive auras dealt direct damage to enemies: Holy Fire, Holy Shock, and Holy Freeze. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Holy Fire, that's a priest direct damage spell, and Holy Shock is a paladin damage/healing spell. They even have the same icon as each other. Well, that's what they are in WoW, but in Diablo 2, all 3 of them were damage auras, where if an enemy was close enough to you, they'd take fire, lightning, or ice damage every few seconds, and every time you hit an enemy with one of your melee swings, they take some extra fire, lightning, or ice damage. So, in Diablo 2, a lot of the Paladin abilities counted as augments to the Paladin's basic attack, just like the seal system from vanilla WoW did. Even in the combat skill trees, there were a lot of augments to your basic attack. Vengeance, for instance, added elemental damage to your attacks, Zeal made you swing multiple times per attack, and there's even a conversion ability that makes your melee swings have a chance to charm an enemy into fighting for you for a while. There's an abuse joke somewhere in there, but I don't think I should make it. Anyhow, why did all these basic attack augments work in Diablo 2 when they didn't work in WoW? The answer lies in one word: auto attack. There was no auto attack in Diablo 2. If you wanted to kill an enemy, you had to keep clicking on it again and again, or at least hold down the mouse button in order to keep hitting it. This meant that abilities that were augments to your auto attack didn't make the game boring in Diablo 2, whereas with WoW, a game where you click once and then you don't need to do anything else to make the melee swings continue, replacing strike abilities with augments to your auto attack pretty much meant you could go AFK during combat. To be fair to the Diablo 2 team that went on to work on vanilla WoW, they did include a couple of strike abilities for Paladins in the beta of World of Warcraft. In fact, in that beta, the Seal and Judgment system wasn't in place yet. Seals in beta were essentially blessings in vanilla. But after WoW went live and they replaced the strikes with seals, the sheer number of melee swing augments in Diablo 2 and in vanilla WoW still drive home the point of just how much WoW borrows from Diablo 2. Of course, another problem that vanilla WoW had that Diablo 2 didn't have was that Paladins in vanilla WoW were horribly crippled when it came to ranged damage. I should probably back up a bit and explain how the classes worked in Diablo 2. In the original Diablo 2, there were 5 classes that were in a spectrum of melee versus caster. The Sorceress, with her fire, lightning, and ice spells, was at the far caster end of the spectrum, and next to her was the Necromancer, who could summon melee minions who had one melee attack, a poison dagger. In the middle of the spectrum was the Amazon, who was kind of like Diablo 2's version of the WoW Hunter class, albeit with more melee abilities than the Hunter has. Though the Hunter in vanilla had some melee abilities too, now that I think about it. On the melee end of the spectrum was the Barbarian, who is a direct analog to the Warrior class in WoW. Right next to him, mostly melee with a little caster mixed in, was the Paladin class. And when you look at the Diablo 2 Paladin's design, you can see that what Blizzard was generally trying to accomplish with the Paladin class was to make him fit in this space in the spectrum. They had a vision for what the class should be, but not necessarily for how the class should play or what he should be good at or how he's to accomplish it. They were asking the question, how can we developers make this class be what we want it to be? Whereas now they're asking questions more like, how will the player do what the player's trying to do, and how can we make sure the player has fun doing so? For an example of how Blizzard was trying to make the Paladin fit this mostly melee, slightly casterish niche, there was a spell that you learned at an early level called Holy Bolt, and it looks and plays an awful lot like a sorceress spell, except that it can only target the undead. If you're not facing the undead, generally you'll need to be in melee to get the job done. And this worked because there were an awful lot of undead in the Diablo 2 game, a lot more than there were in WoW. So this limited targets for your ranged spells idea made the Diablo 2 Paladin look, feel, and be a mostly melee class with a few caster abilities. That being said, at the deepest part of the combat skills tree there is exactly one ranged spell that can target anything, and isn't gimmicky like the damage auras that have a short range unless you put a lot of points into them, and this one ranged spell is Fist of Heavens. It looks a lot different from the Fist of Heaven spell in Diablo 3. If I had to guess, Blizzard wasn't as interested in making the game look flashy back then as they are now. Anyhow, when I finally leveled up enough to get Fist of Heavens, I ended up using Fist of Heavens a lot more than I was using melee swings. It essentially turned my Paladin into a caster when I got it, albeit a caster that didn't have much mana because I was putting my stat points into strength instead of energy while I was leveling up. Anyhow, the fact that I stopped looking like a melee class when I got this spell might be the reason that Blizzard, when they were making vanilla WoW, set me up with the suckiness that was Holy Shock. Fist of Heavens had no cooldown, whereas Holy Shock had a 30-second cooldown. Yeah, you're a melee class if that's all you have for ranged abilities. And Blizzard wanted the Paladin class to be even more melee flavored in WoW than they wanted the Paladin to be in Diablo 2. Furthermore, in Diablo 2, Paladins were allowed to use ranged weapons, and those basic attack augments I was talking about earlier also worked with those ranged weapons. There were viable Diablo 2 Paladin builds that made use of these ranged weapons. The community called a Paladin who specialized in ranged weapons a Ranger. Apparently, that didn't fit Blizzard's idea of what the class should be either in World of Warcraft, so like Fist of Heavens, they took out ranged weapons. And in Vanilla WoW, the lack of ways to get enemies to come to you to fight was a chronic and crippling problem from Paladins, especially since Vanilla was very difficult and the position of enemies and the way you get enemies to come to you mattered a great deal. However, the main question on Blizzard's mind was, how do we make this class be what we want it to be? Not more important things like, how will the player accomplish what he's trying to accomplish using this class? Or, light forbid, is it fun to play this class? Really, that kind of maturity in game development didn't come to Blizzard until they got years of back and forth with the WoW player community under their belts, and their games are much better for it. Another problem Vanilla Paladins had was that they could only heal in Vanilla. They didn't get good at tanking until the Burning Crusade, and they didn't get good at DPS until Wrath. There were a lot of things that fed into this problem, but I have to say the biggest reason was that in Vanilla, they made our heals too powerful even before you factor in gear. The fact is, in Vanilla, there wasn't as much healing gear available as there is now, so the base power of heals mattered more, and Paladins had quite a bit at the base. Couple that with a 12-second Divine Shield, Lay on Hands, and Plate Armor, and you get a very powerful defensive class. Paladins in Vanilla were hard to kill. And unfortunately, when your defense is that powerful, you can't add offensive abilities on top of that, especially offensive abilities that cause on-demand damage, because if you do, you'll get something hideously overpowered, and you need offensive abilities that do on-demand damage in order to tank. Otherwise, you can't make enemies stop attacking your allies and start attacking you, which is the whole point of tanking. Plus, until the Burning Crusade, Blizzard was unwilling to give Paladins a real taunt that would let us recover threat once we lost it. We had some threat-generating tools in Vanilla, but they were a chance on hit or fed off of our holy damage, and since our holy damage wasn't on demand, yeah, we couldn't tank. Pretty much the raw base power of our heals and defensive oh snap buttons meant that we couldn't get any offensive abilities, and so the only thing we were able to do effectively in Vanilla was heal. We had 3 trees, but no matter which tree you picked, you were still doing the same thing with the same tools. Which tree you chose pretty much decided the question of what other mostly useless stuff you had tacked on. Sad. You know, if I'd known then what I know now, then back in 2005 when they were deciding what changes to make for Paladins in patch 1.9, I'd have made YouTube videos suggesting they set up our talents so that our base healing power was nerfed and only up to scratch with other classes if you spent the points in the talent tree for it. And probably I'd have asked for some of our oh snap buttons to be made into talents too, like Divine Shield. If they gave us those nerfs, then Blizzard would have been free to add some freaking on-demand damage without making the class overpowered. But all of that is way in the past. Right now, the base stats of healing or damage spells don't matter near as much as how they scale with gear, and other classes have powerful oh snap buttons now too. So at this point in WoW, there's room for on-demand damage abilities for Paladins, and we can tank, heal, or DPS just fine. But I have to say, the biggest change that has benefited both World of Warcraft and Diablo 3 has to be the fact that Blizzard has changed its game design philosophy.